very large group. Yeah, I heard that thing. All right. So if everybody can see the document, this was the feedback form, and we had a breakout session in which we were able to review the requirements up until Ericsson, because that's until where we had the inputs at that point in time. So we have two new inputs from Wind River and Tim, which we need to review first. But just to give you overall introduction to the document, what's going on so far. When we reviewed our requirements in the breakout session, the goal for that was to better understand the requirements, how every operator or the organization is feeling should be the focus of V1. And in the V1, we needed something small, fundamental to solve to establish the baseline for the future releases. Has to be simple and has to be differentiating for us from the status quo. So people who had their requirements and focus for V1 very aligned to the point that we could actually deliver the focus of the V1. As we understood during the call, I constantly highlighted those in the green color. And some of the things which seemed very important to our longer term requirements and which seemed a bit more ambitious to accomplish in V1, I marked all of that as yellow. And this is very abstract understanding. Maybe I have not understood some of the things right. And here is a forum for us to go back to that, change the colors, and make sure that our understanding is correct. So we need to review the things that we reviewed in the breakout session again. But since we haven't heard back from the Wind River and Tim at all, we'll go to those first and try to understand their feedback, what they have done on the document, and ask them to quickly take 5 minutes each and present to us what is their view on the short-term V1 requirements versus the long-term requirements, which we have highlighted in the yellow color. So do we have participation from Wind River and Tim today on the bridge?
This is Fabrizio Moggio from Team.
Excellent. Thanks for being here. Do we have Bin Yang from Wind River as well? Or anyone from Wind River who can actually walk us through the requirements that they have created here? Okay, so I'm not seeing the screen, but I haven't heard from them. So if Tim is already represented on the bridge today, we should go first to the Tim and understand their user stories for V1.
Sure. I mean, it is quite an high-level user story. Our main purpose, and you can see clearly our purpose looking at the KPIs, is to define a user stories that covers different aspects of the pipeline. Our main target was to define the steps of this pipeline, to identify which steps are actually covered in V1. So the pipeline of this journey in which you develop and deploy the application goes from the artifacts retrieval, their customization, the infrastructure settings, service deployment, validation, and lifecycle management. I mean, for sure, in V1, lifecycle management, if available, will be kind of simple. But as you can see, we are focusing on the definition of the steps. And so to understand what V1 is going to provide. And you can see that in the KPIs. So in the KPIs, you can see that we can somehow define what is covered in V1. And the KPIs are related to the number of the stages that are actually implemented in V1, covering the defined pipeline. And especially, it will be important to us to understand the amount of automation and the amount of required manual manual intervention, because we are sure, I mean, it is impossible, I think, that V1 will cover everything automatically. So something must be manual, probably. Some, for example, configuration or some pre-configuration to cover and to map the intents and so on. So this is the kind of journey that we expect NIFIO or V1 to cover, and we really would like to see what is going to be actually covered by the solution. This for V1. In long term, we are quite ambitious, actually, and we focus more on telco requirements. So slicing, and so especially what in terms of customer service management function, network service management function. I'm sure you are familiar with this terminology from 3GPP. So there are the 3GPP defined management function, the basic one that you have in terms of slice covering. And so the communication service, the network slice, and the network slice subnet management function. And then this is step number one, point number one. In point number two, we think that Nefion can somehow also cover the task of license management tool. I mean, this is something we are thinking of. I don't know if it is in scope of this work, but it could be something interesting to have for the different cloud-native functions, I mean. And then the last point is related to federation among operators. I mean, these are for sure things that are quite futuristic, but yeah, maybe, and for the future releases.
This sounds really good. What is your name again? I can't go back to the screen to check the name.
Yeah, it is Moggio Fabrizio.
Moggio sounds really good, actually. I understood all of the requirements. Maybe if I reiterate my understanding on what I felt, the focus from your organization right now for V1 seems that in the short term, you are very focused on the mechanics of how we build the pipeline.
Yes,
on defining the onboarding of your actual function. So whatever the function be, for example, for now we have considered free 5GC, but whatever the network functions within free 5GC are, you are more concerned about how we retrieve the artifacts, how we deploy the artifacts, and how do we reduce the manual effort in deployment of our intent-based configurations on the infrastructure and the onboarding of the application itself. So this is very similar to a lot of other organizations ask, which is what is an excellent outcome of this exercise. So I have highlighted this in the green color, which means that a lot of us are looking for very similar things, which actually converges our requirements for V1 very nicely. I was going to ask you a couple of questions on these so that I could understand that could these become the focus of our V1, or should that be a little bit of longer term focus based on the scope of what the work is. You're saying ability of policy-driven service customization. So what do you really mean by that? Maybe we can dig into this one a little bit so I can add colors to that.
Yeah, I mean, we think that when a service is requested to the infrastructure, to Nefio, you know, it is the service is requested in terms of intent, and those intents must be transformed in actual deployment, defining the correct artifacts, and maybe the modules of the network functions, and the correlation amongst these artifacts. Uh, is there in Nephew a policy-driven module that helps the platform to connect and the modules and to define which implementation of the requested services, the requested service we can do. So if there is a module that is related to policies, because maybe, for example, a service is requested, the service maybe can leverage on an existing already deployed infrastructure, but maybe the policy doesn't allow the reuse of an existing service because it is allocated for a special customer. That's sort of example. So a simple one at least. So this is the kind of policy-driven service customization we are thinking of.
Okay, this looks like development of some intelligence within our orchestration system that actually helps us find the right place in the infrastructure to apply that function for us. And our ability to manage our deployments through the policy-driven framework. I think we have a question on the group. Somebody has raised a hand. Go ahead.
Well, that was just me. Yeah, I just wanted to say I love this requirement. Don't know that it's a V1 requirement.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit advanced. Yeah,
but it's awesome, right? So that definitely is something we would want within scope of Nephew, is that sort of intelligence. And there's some little bit. So one of my, just to be clear, one of my things I want to propose, hopefully today, but I have meetings like all day, so I don't know if I'll be able to finish it. For the SIG automation piece is sort of like, here are the components, but there's also a discussion of like, what are our milestones? So I really want to have, I think I mentioned this last week somewhere, we have a demo we're trying to do in mid-November at the One Summit and a workshop. And so I really want to have a sort of alpha release that does something. I don't know what exactly yet, a week before that. And so you'll see some hints, I hope. I'll be proposing what I think the alpha should be, and what Google can contribute to that, right, in the next day or two. And there'll be some hints of that. So there'll be an idea of like a higher level controller that understands 5G core topology. And then it's like, okay, that means we need, and it uses policies, but not very sophisticated policies, more just like, here's a label selector, install these network functions on these clusters, install those network functions on those clusters. And since I'm a 5G core, I know what those network functions are. I know how to glue them together and whatever it is. So that's the sort of vision. We'll see what we can get done, but I love this requirement. And but yeah, probably not a V1 type of deal.
It's absolutely correct. I mean, the last two requirements are a sort of challenge. Just to point out that we would like to have something in that direction. It is clear to us that both policy-driven and SDKs are, I mean, for V1 really challenging features, but it was just to move the first step in certain direction. But it is absolutely fine to have them in yellow. It was expected.
It is, yellow means North Star, means that it is going to be a direction achieved. We need to work towards that, but maybe not necessarily right away in V1, but the North Star actually gives us a direction to how we work on our incremental releases to eventually achieve them. So very good requirements, and it's definitely a part of the focus. All the other ones that you mentioned in yellow, very similar requirements have come from the other teams. For example, how do we comply with 3GPP on Tosca? Now, Tosca is a higher level template that is traditionally using in the status quo. How do we merge with the status quo, where the existing orchestration systems that are used by 3GPP and ETSI eventually merge with Nephew? That is a part of the architectural exercise that Kaushik and I have been talking about, where we need to get these requirements and come down to an architectural alignment within this group. So is there going to be a way in which we eventually merge with Tosca, because Tosca is already adopted by ETSI and 3GPP? maybe that's one solution, or maybe those are the solutions that we need to look at, or maybe we just expose APIs and then work over SOL 005 and eventually integrate with the CSMF, NSMF, and SSMF. So again, these are good requirements and some things that where we need to basically find alignment on the architecture with the broader ecosystem of the group as well. CNF license management is absolutely excellent requirement, and this already exists in a lot of orchestration tools. We already have it automated on our side within our organization. It's an extremely important part of checklist when you're doing the deployments of a telco network function. And license management for every single network function is different. So we have different solutions implemented for different types of license management, which is an extremely good requirement to consider for Nephew as well. Between multi-operators communication, my feeling is there something you're talking about MEF architecture?
I was actually thinking of GSMA, the operation group, actually, but there are many places in which this multi-operator thing is relevant.
Yeah, correct. There's some architecture in the MEF, Legato, Sonata, that model of intercommunication. GSMA has a framework, so definitely North Star requirement for us to take a look at once we get to that level from Nephew.
Yeah.
So immediate focus on Nephew is really on the infrastructure and operators and the extension to Kubernetes, which is basically a direct competition of our Helm, the imperative automation. The declarative, as we go higher the stack, there is a lot of unknowns at the moment on how the evolution of this community will happen and how Nephew will evolve to either intersect with the existing status quo or replace some of the existing status quo. That is happening, and we will constantly work through this community to see where the direction of requirements is going and what would be the path of least resistance and the evolution of this community, how well we are growing into that we need to see. And the North Star requirements will guide us through that. So John, if you have no more questions, if you have comments, please go ahead and do that. And then we'll go into the rest of the organization's requirements so that we can give a quick understanding to this group on what happened so far.
We have a few other hands, I think.
Okay, I can't see the screen, so it's good. Go ahead, whoever has questions.
So just a quick comment of what John said and also what you said, Sana, regarding policies. John mentioned, at first we're going to start with a very limited scope of policies. That makes sense. I just want to underscore, right? We imagine the policies that Nephew supports will be a small part of a much larger policy framework that will probably be integrated, right? And some of those policies will go to Nephew, some will go to other parts, for example, service orchestration. So we'll just take that into account. And I think part of what we're really trying to do in the next meeting with automation is look at the components that Nephew has, but we're thinking of them, or at least I am, in relation to existing components, right? So Nephew will work within an ecosystem, and part of that ecosystem is probably a very rich policy framework. And you did mention Tosca, and Tosca has policies as well, but I'll admit that they're very anemic at this point. We're trying to beef them up for Tosca 2.0, although I don't think we'll quite get there. But Tosca could be another place where some, at least of the basic policies, and probably even the policies that are good enough for Nephew could be stored. So you would be able, if you are packaging a CSAR, Tosca, the entire CNF with all the infrastructure plus the workload resources, you can also couple those policies with them. But again, those would probably be limited to CNF policies and not those kind of larger policies that a more serious policy framework would take care of. Yeah, that's it.
Sounds very good, Tol. I think our ability to dissect the big concept of policy, I think is going to be incremental and an ongoing exercise. So in the short term, I think we can focus on the policies which we talked about and how we decide which infrastructure to be used for which network function and how we scale the network function, or maybe things that are relevant to the network function itself and that scope of infrastructure and the function. I think that could be the policy problem-solving scope in the short term for Nephew. And then how we work with the policy of the service and the size and all these other things, could be the longer term goal of our policy interaction with the rest of the policy engines, or if NIFU has ability to grow at that level, maybe that's what becomes our scope at that point in time. But I think it's an extremely important point of how we evolve our policy. And to your point, where do we write these policies? Is operator a right part to write, or should these be written at a higher level, like something in more declarative, like Tosca, and then imperative is reacting to the policy? These are the architectural questions which need to be addressed with the automation group, I think, Saul, to start off right, for doing the short-term things first and then building towards the longer-term requirements.
Right.
But do you think, go ahead, sorry.
And none of this will block us in the short term. So we can definitely have a very focused scope at first with a few policies, and they can be CRDs. And we can work with that. And, you know, again, other parts of the tool chain early on could generate these custom resources that for Nefio to take care of. So we're keeping our scope very, very focused. So I hope nobody takes this into account that suddenly Nefio is going to add a policy framework. I don't think that's what we intend to do. We're not trying to replace things that already exist, but rather work with them.
Right. Absolutely.
One comment I had, sorry, I raised my hand, but
excuse me, Daniel, if you don't mind, Vish is on the line, I guess. He raised his hand.
Yeah,
Please
should I go
go on.
next, or is it related to
I
this?
think it's oh, sorry. Is it related to this, or it's a new topic?
Dan, if it is related to what?
it was related.
Okay.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So what I wanted to say is that I'd like to start, because it's the fourth time we try to do an industry effort around cloud native something, pretty much. I would personally try to make it as less overcrowded, so that things like Tosca and other mechanisms can come up at some point if they are needed. But if you try to stick to the nature of cloud native automations, as we initially started with Nefio, they keep trying to get the most wind out of it before we start introducing too much complexities and external systems that we thought about before, and we might want to reuse somewhere, because otherwise we end up with a really big mess from the day one. So I really would like to start with that as the lowest denominator possible, and grow from there. And now when we see a problem that needs to be solved somewhere else, then we can engage. Otherwise it gets really bloated really quick.
Yeah, that's exactly the point, Daniel. Why everything else that actually talks about Tosca and our integration with the rest of the broader HC and 3GPP ecosystem is all in yellow at the moment is that it might become a focus in the future. We need to have a way for Nefio to become operational in everybody's network eventually, to become a part of the bigger ecosystem. But in the short term, if you take a look at this document and you see all the things that are green are exactly focused on the Kubernetes side, infrastructure, deployment of the network functions, and how we are deploying that network function. That is pretty much the scope for the short term, which is going to be the focus for V1. So if you take a look at the document and look at all the green color, that is exactly on that cloud native automation, which we discussed, I think, in the beginning, way before Nefio, and that's going to be the focus for V1, and maybe V2 as well, because we won't be able to accomplish all of what we have highlighted in green right away. The automation group has to come back to us on the feasibility and the focus on how much can they cover from the green in their V1. And Tall is here, John is here, and that's how we understood, right? This is going to be a proposal and input, and we're going to find their responses to the recommendations.
Wish you were ahead of me, and so you go ahead, and after that I will go. I have a few observations. You go ahead first.
Yeah, Sana, thank you. I think when you walked through some of the use cases, you explained it very well. You were trying to say there were similarities and stuff like that, and that was awesome. One other request that I have for you and Kaushik maybe is that, I know there are a lot of use cases. What might help the crowd or the folks here is that, as you're looking at these use cases, if you can sort of say, hey, this is what Nephew definitely wants to solve the use case, or this piece of the use case is probably what we are focusing on, rather, and these things which you try to say is like being solved elsewhere. If as part of this, if you're coming up with something like what is Nephew trying to solve and what it is not, if you can bucket them, that'll be great, because what that will help build that living document of what it is and what it is not is, at least people walk away with, oh, okay, Nephew is trying to solve this particular area. It is not trying to resolve some of the other things. That will help, I think, to bring us back on track and keep our focus, is what my observation was, and will also help, like I said, the community in general, so that we don't keep repeating the same questions, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So this is a good question. I asked.
If I can go, Vish, if you don't mind, because very similar, so that you can respond together. I had a very similar observation as Vish. So I'm seeing there are three things I could see here. I mean, if you can figure out, okay, this is what Nephew will do today or tomorrow, or this is what Nephew is that will not do. For example, sometimes we are talking about license management, dependency management, service management, a lot of different things. If you can distinguish between this is what Nephew is, this is what it's going to do, and this is what is going to rely on third-party systems to do, and this is definitely what Nephew will not do. If you can do that, that would be really helpful, because then we can really understand what the scope of Nephew is, and what architectural pieces it depends on the other pieces. For example, it could be bias configuration. We could say it depends on somebody else. We will do this, but we will not materially design and implement it. Will depend on somebody else. And then it's also very useful to say this is what Nephew will not do, because that's not what it's intended to be. I mean, if you do that, that will be really helpful. And the other thing I observed is, I went to the doc. Thank you so much. It's a very nice doc. I found there were a lot of themes, related themes here, such as infrastructure configuration, installation discovery, CNF deployment, southbound, northbound API. So for all these different requirements, if we could create themes and then define requirements under those, then we could tackle in which release what goes. Thank you.
Yeah, that sounds good. So I think I will quickly go to the two questions that you asked. Number one is the scoping. So I had very similar questions asked during the Nephew Summit when we were in face-to-face in California, and I was actually brainstorming on those with Kandan. How do we scope the focus of Nephew? So we are really looking for a solution in the cloud native space, like Daniel mentioned, where we can approach the solution in a very cloud native way, that closer to the cloud and our existing status quo and our existing automation model is not satisfying us to become fully cloud native. So that lower level Kubernetes deployment models that exist today, and I will decode what I'm trying to say. For example, today, if you have 5G core and you're using a Helm chart based deployment, and you are using some CI/CD pipeline to do the configurations on your infrastructure, so it's an extremely out-of-band experience, and I'll walk you through that. So we are probably using a CI/CD pipeline to deploy the infrastructure configurations, and that configurations have no idea what applications will eventually run on me. That is happening out of band. The next step, we are probably using through some automation tool to deploy the Helm charts for the deployment of the 5G core. That is our step number 2. Step number 3 comes, for example, the configurations of the functions itself. The configurations could be very simple day 1, day 2 configurations, or some application level configurations that just make the application live. So unfortunately, a lot of the 5G functions, I'm talking about the core network functions, RAN is worse. I'll go to RAN next if people have questions about RAN. I'm talking about the UPF, AMF, SMF, those kind of 5G network functions. Their configurations are extremely closed within their wrappings called EMSs or ENMs or VNF managers, however you term that. Then you build a plugin towards that and you reach that element, and then you are going inside that network function, maybe through SFTP or somehow to basically apply your configurations. Now, The exercise of bringing up one network function has an extremely out-of-band, disaggregated streams. Configuration is happening from elsewhere, deployment of function is happening from elsewhere, configuration of the function itself is happening from elsewhere. To me, when I was working with Nephew and why I volunteered and dedicated this time to Nephew and how I foresee is this is the fundamental focus and problem that we need to solve to achieve efficiency in our cloud native deployments. This has to be an in-band activity. The network function has to dictate the intent on applying the right configurations to the infrastructure, has to dictate the requirements, and there has to be a model in the cloud native way how we are using CRDs to perform the configurations into the network function. Now, this requires some work on the network function vendor part as well. How do we work with our respective network function vendor to comply with the cloud native requirements? And sometimes I call that the 12 factors compliance, in which your CNF becomes truly cloud native and actually conforms to the requirements of the cloud native world, which then makes the Nephew's fundamental idea successful. So if that explains the scope of the Nephew, this should be the immediate focus of the Nephew to solve that big fundamental problem. Now, if we are successful with doing what I said, eventually our connection with the rest of the ecosystem and how the existing space of the orchestration has been evolving since last many years in the world of Etsy and 3GPP, the rest will come out of this, either through integration to the third-party solutions or through building right APIs to the system. We cannot be boiling the ocean within Nephew. This should not become ONAP. ONAP was a very big scope, so we could not get that to the operational level where people could start using and working with it. It was a bit more complex for everyone to be able to leverage the benefits of ONAP, although it was a very big concept and a lot of global interaction was happening on the project, but it's still difficult to actually operationalize. My hope was that we work on Nephew in a way that it becomes operationally ready for some of the near-term, short-term challenges and deliver the results faster, which will actually improve adoption and which will actually keep us all engaged with that. Because if that becomes a part of our organizational strategy, then our interest and our work towards Nephew will be more meaningful, how we are growing in this community together. So if that explains the scope problem, that is the hope. I will work with Kaushik on that and come up with an architecture which will actually help us see the scope as well, and how we use the existing status quo and how we are challenging the existing status quo. That should become clear after the exercise. Does it make sense?
That sounds good.
Excellent. We have more questions here.
Yes, it's also useful. So it's kind of useful to say that these are the things, at least for my understanding, license management is not something we intend to do. I may be wrong, but it's also clearly, and also we are not end-to-end service orchestration. We are not going to set up end-to-end service. That's not the scope of Nephew. So it's also kind of useful to state that as well. And then based on that, we can choose what should be the V1 candidate.
Yeah. You know what? A lot of times, all the answers are not there right away. So sometimes, John can, of course, chime in and answer. Sometimes how the evolution of the open source community happens is that when the adoption is growing, a lot of people start to solve problems through that in ways which we have not used before. So hypothetically speaking, what if tomorrow we have a license management tool somewhere in the open source and we build an integration to that, and which becomes a part of this community's ongoing exercise to start using a separate project with that and becoming inclusive to our existing scope of work. And sometimes we might be using heterogeneous products from our own solutions, how we are approaching that, and this stays outside the scope of that. So some of our evolution will be organic, how we evolve and how we solve, right?
Absolutely. The evolution, I'm not questioning. I'm just asking our current scope and what do we stand for at this point of time. The evolution will be organic. It's going to happen. The only constant is change. I totally get it. Open source or closed source doesn't matter, right? So right. I'm saying is at this point of time, if we can clarify, this is not in scope for Nephew's North Star at this point of time. That's very beneficial.
Yeah,
that's right. That's right.
I mean, like we can define areas like license management as a sort of dependency we may have. And part of our goal is to identify gaps in the ecosystem that Nefio might consume, but Nefio itself may not build those things.
Yeah.
And so identifying those through the requirements, I think, is still very helpful. But drawing the scope is also, yes, and saying that's not something we're going to build. Correct.
And I have more questions on this from Wim. He's basically asking very fundamental questions. Is RAN in the scope or not? I think this is confusing us, so I'm going to clear this out. And I think we all agreed on the 5G core, that is a free 5G core to be used as a focus for V1. So I think I'll answer their comments and try to explain that RAN could become a part of our focus in one of the future releases, but for the immediate focus, we will be going with the free 5G at the moment to show the user stories that we are converging on the green with every organization right now.
Yeah, Shanna, it's Wim here. I'm on the call. I actually just raised my hand. So
sorry, go ahead. Please go ahead.
To clarify a little bit my comments here. So one is indeed the scope. I think we just need to make it clear what we are talking about. There has been in the past some discussion, and that's why I threw it back into the list, like cluster setup. I believe is probably not in scope for V1. Maybe yes, maybe no. So I listed here a number of them. I think networking, sometimes some people would like to have it in scope of release 1, but then other people said not from the beginning. Network, I mean, just to clarify, probably the fabric that is attached to the cluster, not the networking inside the Kubernetes side. And then, yeah, I think for the core, it seems to be that I think it's pretty consistent that it's SMF, AMF, NRF, and UPF in COPS mode from what I've seen. So it's pretty consistent. I just wanted to clarify to make it clear. And then, so the point where I really raised my hand for is actually the configuration through CRDs. And I mean, if I look at configuration, for me, it's everything. It can be very broad. And what I think, speaking as a vendor, right, and also having gone through onboarding of these cloud native applications, one of the experiences that I had is as a vendor, people that deliver a network function, today it's mainly through Helm charts, right? We couple the infra requirements, so meaning I need a network attachment function for Multus, just to give you an example, in the Helm chart as an example. And I believe that is not right. So there is too much, what I'm trying to say is that there is too much infrastructure requirements that those network functions have that are actually built. Today it's Helm, but let's say if we don't architect it right, we have the same problem in Nefio. So I believe one of the focuses of what I would like to see in version 1 or release 1 is that decoupling, that a network function can basically say, I have a set of requirements that I want to get fulfilled. Someone takes care of it, and it will basically act upon it in the way that Kubernetes controllers act upon it. And then the second thing, which I think you also mentioned, is when you deploy those network functions, they call an EMS and of some kind, and then you can get some config into it. The second piece is, besides that decoupling of the infra from the network function, is actually how do you get some of the, let's say, initial configuration onto it to get the base service up and running. Because typically, my experience is that it's also very much tied into the initial Helm charts that those functions gets delivered. And I think if we can focus on those two aspects alone, I think we already have a very nice segue into how you can structure the infrastructure and how you can get some benefits from the automation or the cloud native automation frameworks that people want to have. Just my 2 cents.
Yes, that makes total sense, and we are all apparently very aligned on our immediate focus. So my hope was that we would go through the rest of the organizations where we have the green color, and we have still, I think, 15 more minutes left. Mm-hmm. So I'll do my best to cover the green part of what I thought is green in the TELUS recommendation, and I'll quickly go to the roundtable of the next, because we have a very good we had a very good discussion on the breakout session. I want to make sure that the rest of you understand that, right? So what you mentioned, the free 5GC, I wanted a comparison built in our first V1 in which we could compare that with the status quo on exactly what I mentioned. We are using out-of-band deployments. If we could write our artifacts in the V1 in a way that shows the nephew's comparison with the status quo in how we handle infrastructure and how we handle configurations and how we handle deployments, and how do you make that more intent-driven through the use of operators and CRDs. That comparison, I think, was something that I wanted to see in the V1. And it doesn't mean that we have to deploy everything with the Helm again. It just means that we know how that was. We will be able to build that comparison through seeing the deployment through the nephew's model. Free 5GC, and I also mentioned that the number of network functions that we can cover from the free 5GC architecture, I have left that open to the SIG automation to come back and actually give us an estimate on the work, and we can scope it that way. So some of the answers to this V1 will be clear after automation SIG absorbs our requirements and then come back with their recommendations. I would like Bernard, if he's on the bridge, to actually walk us.
Is there audio problem?
I have the feeling it is. Yeah.
Yes, she's trying.
Seems like it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
We also have some hands raised, I think, as well.
Just maybe, Sana, I fully agree with your vision, but I'm still
Okay.
about
Okay. Well, I guess, yeah. Where were we? So I'm not. I don't think we'll get through all the requirements, but why don't we at least cover the hands? So Eric.
Yeah, just to say, I fully agree with.
Oh, you're super quiet, Eric. If that was you talking.
Yeah, can you hear me better now?
Yeah.
Yeah. So just my concern, I said in previous meeting, we really need to help the CNF developer to provide them the right tools, the right guidelines to prove that it's possible to have this kind of solution with all this inbound management, because it's the only way to have Nephew, let's say, be used by the telco service provider. And that's something we really need. I really need to focus on. I would like also to have maybe the feedback from the vendors who contribute to the community to know what vision they have with regard to this, maybe a new way of let's say managing the network function. I think it's key also to have everyone on board for this project.
Yeah. Well, Vim is from Nokia, so
yeah, but we are also people from.
But I agree.
Ericsson. Yeah.
I'm not disagreeing in any way. I think that in my experience, so we definitely need to both publish sort of best practices, and I also want to put together. It's just been on my back burner. Almost like I'd like to get some of the folks that have done sort of the very fundamental Kubernetes API design to help us with making sure that our APIs are sort of properly structured to be able to be serve the needs we have in an extensible way. So the that's one thing, and similarly, best practices around developing controllers and operators in frameworks. I think Fabrizio also asked for SDKs. Like, we would love to be able to do that. I think the first step in V1 though is we're gonna actually build some of this for a simple vendor, meaning free 5GC, and we're going to learn a lot from that. And so that's part of the reason we don't have those materials yet, is because we don't have those answers yet. We know that this is possible, and we've seen this done in the Kubernetes community, like with, say, gateway APIs and gateway implementations, but we still have a lot of learning to do to get to where we can give that kind of feedback or build an SDK. So totally on board with what you're saying. We're just not sure we're ready to do it yet. Next hand, unless Eric has a...
John Senthil Kumar also has a raised hand here.
Okay, Senthil, yeah. All right, and then I'll let you take back over.
I just wanted to say that I'm agreeing with Wim's comment. I was the one who brought up in the automation forum that about the infrastructure provisioning itself. So at the time, John, you said that based on what our network architecture group decides, we'll go from there. But again, I see Sana's pointing back to automation, right? I just want to make sure that free 5GC is a good place to start with, but it doesn't have the restrictions which typically the RAN workloads have. I just want to make sure that the architecture is set right, because when we take free 5GC as an first use case, right? So this is simple enough, which doesn't require all the initial changes we talked about, right? Being it real-time kernel or driver changes or upgrade or restart. So all those requirements, the dependencies are not there here in this case for free 5GC. I just don't want to miss out on the base architecture capturing those things. So that is really crucial, that to clarify whether Nephew will focus on that or not, right? So
Senthil, can you go a little bit deeper on the infrastructure requirements of the RAN versus the 5G core?
The infrastructure requirements of the RAN itself, right? When you have an accelerator and other stuff. So some of the configurations require a reload, a BIOS settings, additional BIOS configurations are required for a RAN workload, which requires a restart of the system, building of the cluster, again, reinstalling the OS. Because once you change the BIOS system, the kernel doesn't pick it up directly or dynamically. You have to do some recompiling, repackaging, and all those things. Right? Today, that is how it's been built up from the ground up. Right. So how are we going to, if Nephew is already expecting a Kubernetes cluster to be up and running with all those changes, right? Then it's difficult, right? That's what we discussed in the previous SIG.
So the behavior that you're describing on the ORAN functions, is it a VDU or VCU that requires
VDU?
VDU, and is it so? Does all vendors has this requirement that the cluster has to be brought up again in the middle of the deployment? It's
Most
a very
of them we have seen. No, they have all
behavior.
dependencies. It's not that clusters need to be brought up, and more in order to bring up the entire stack, RAN stack, they have requirements, and there are tons of BIOS requirements needs to be configured. Once you set up the BIOS requirements, there is a kernel change which needs to happen, and all those things, right? There are a lot of additional dependencies for the kernel itself. Because they all need a real-time kernel to support it, right? So we need to have the base set.
That's right. Sentinel, which organization are you from?
I'm from Dell.
You're from Dell, right? Right now, I'm from TELUS. We are doing a ORAN RFP. There are lots of implementations from a lot of RAN vendors which are non-cloud native. I have a section in the RFP which is specifically evaluating the behavior of the VDU and VCU, how they need to solve the cloud native problems versus the ORAN performance requirements problems. And different vendors have different implementations. This is not a part of our standards evolution yet. So I think ORAN is in a very evolutionary state at the moment. We need to settle down as in the global ecosystem around where do we find our ORAN cloud nativeness in a scale of 0 to 10. ORAN currently, the current deployments and implementations of the VDUs and VCUs are extremely non-cloud native at the moment. They are not even ready for like a CNF kind of deployment in the cloud world. So what I'm trying to say is that the questions that you're raising and the points that you are basically highlighting are important. ORAN is definitely a part of the scope in the Nephew because that's where Nephew will become useful to a very large number of greenfield use cases that are coming into our networks. But we are not settled on the VDU, VCU cloud native requirements yet, as as industry at this point in time. So we start with the free 5GC, where there's a lot of dependency on the infrastructure, CNI plugins, and the network accelerations as well. But at least we have seen a convergence. Like we have seen this more than we have understood and seen ORAN at this point in time. So I think leave this as an open question. Infrastructure management is definitely a part of the nephew scope, but what behavior do we expect from network function, and how do we want the network function to behave in a cloud native world, and what will happen in the ORAN is yet to be seen. So I think this is something we can take again in the future.
Yeah, sure, sir. No, I'm okay with taking a free 5G. All I'm saying is the network architecture has to be taken into account for that. So I do see the cloud native vendors right now. If you've seen even the MWC Americas, right? So a lot of people did a cloud native VDU. Even those VDUs we are trying internally at Dell. We are trying to bring up a lot of cloud native VDUs here, multiple vendors, right? Everything has additional requirements on all those things, right? There are tons of requirements in order to bring up the workload itself. So that's what I just want to make sure that we are just capturing and we are not forgetting about that.
This ORAN will definitely be a scope of the nephew at some point in time, because I had a lot of discussions with Kandan in the beginning. The MEC and ORAN are definitely the greenfield deployments where nephew can be used. But I think it's up to the construct of the VDUs and VCUs, how well we can leverage the benefits of nephew. Honestly speaking, the way I have seen the existing deployments of the VDU and VCU so far, what I'm trying to say is that even if we use nephew, we are not going to see the value of nephew in the way they're currently designed and deployed. I hope you see my point.
Yeah, no, I do. No,
You do,
I see
right?
how complex.
So
I
this
to
is
see
something
that.
evolving. This is evolving, and we need to see how we can use nephew to still bring a value to that world, which is something that is on the radar at the moment, and how we will work towards that. It's a work in progress, is what I'm thinking. RAN is the most non-cloud native functions I've ever seen, and we need to solve that as a group and as an industry at the moment.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, let's see what happens to our efforts towards ORAN side. Ravi has a question as well.
No, yeah, it's more a comment, Sana. So, I mean, at least from a ORAN perspective, because as I said, I participate in it. The requirements I think are well understood in the sense, like, there are good kind of let's say informational specifications that lays it out, and there's a good exhaustive set of use cases that have been kind of captured both from the infrastructure management, cluster management, from the network function configuration, deployment perspective, at least in working group 6. And a lot of the normatives is what is basically being kind of the stage, kind of say stage 2 and stage 3 work is what is being done right now. So I think, you can say there is some mature part of ORAN, which is your say open front hall or some of that E2, A1 kind of specification. But yeah, working group 6, the O2 specification is still kind of evolving. But from a requirement perspective, and that's what, we had an initial contribution on ORAN small cell use case for RAN specifically for nephew, and we have captured quite a bit of that in there. So yeah, just want to kind of comment on the current state of affairs with at least ORAN working group 6.
Thanks, Ravi. I think ORAN should become a scope of our discussion in one of the future releases, where we attempt to deploy one VDU or one VCU and see how far we can go and show the value of nephew, and how well we can assume some of the things to be behaving as cloud native in the cloud world. So I think that should become our focus in the future. I'm going to leave it to you, John. I think we could not finish the rest of the document and we could not review. I think we should pick it up in our next session. And we have one more raised hand as well.
Hi, this is Padma. I totally agree with the comment you made, where you talked about VDUs not being cloud native yet, right? So one of the things that we have to consider when we do this nephew or evolve it to even in ORAN, the discussions are to look at hybrid networks, right? You're going to have this slow transition when you go from the classical way of deployment into this cloud native or more container-based or VM-based deployment. And are we also going to take into account both categories and make sure that there is some way that we can address both?
I'll give you my 2 cents and I'll leave John to chime in here as well, because he has been working with Nephew for a long time and he has some vision around solving these as well. So my feeling is, Padma, one of the behaviors that I was hoping and expecting is that as we promote the value proposition of Nephew and as we work with our common vendors, the global ecosystem of community here, we will be able to drive some of the vendors to develop more cloud native functions, because that's when we leverage the full benefits of Nephew, the value of Nephew, and actually our transition towards going into the cloud world. That's when we start reaping the benefits of the public cloud and all the environment services and APIs that are actually available there. When we are not cloud native, and if we are talking about the transitional model, that's where all the other automation systems have always existed. We have tons of automation models that exist today. Our value proposition will actually deliver value when the functions are truly cloud native. We can use Nephew somehow over non-cloud native functions as well, but it would be probably delivering a 20% value of our exercise. This is my great answer to your question. John, if you have more to add.
No, understood. Just to respond to you, sorry, I understood. But as you know, since you're coming from TELUS, I assume many of the operators, it is not going to be a cutover, right? There's not a greenfield alone scenario and a classical scenario, but it more be what they are calling brownfield, right? Where there's a mix of both types. So that's when that's the root of my question. I'll let John answer.
Yeah, Padma, that makes total sense. And you know, my feeling is that when the greenfield, brownfield coexist together, we would have a mechanism or a model or a plugin to assume that some of the automations are existing as is, while some of our latest greenfield, more cloud native deployments on the public cloud could be using Nephew, or even on an on-prem cloud could use Nephew, because it's Kubernetes, right? Wherever we have Kubernetes. If something is not cloud native, could use the old deployment models, then we can find a way for us to intersect with that.
Okay.
Automation is not stopping us to do that from any angle.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, we're over time, but I'll just say really quick, 100% agree with both of you, frankly. But what Sana was saying is my vision of it as well, where if Nephew is there, you know, say something needs a BIOS rebuild and all of this stuff, like that could be fine, and Nephew could still manage that process or delegate that process to existing automations. But what could happen is that you lose agility, right? So you don't get all the value, like Sana was saying. So the idea is the big thing in cloud for enterprises has been moving from a vertical stack, rack and stack, individual machines for individual applications to an API on-demand consumption model. And that's what we want to push for in this industry as well. It's not going to get there right away. It's going to take a long time, and if it ever gets there. But we want to move as much in that direction as we can. And if we can consume 50% of our compute network via an API demand-driven thing, that's still a huge benefit, right? So it can increase our utilization and everything else. So it's a matter of yes, a transition phase, and of being able to delegate or defer or wait for those external things, and maybe we don't get all the value we could. But it also creates a pressure on the vendors, like Sana is talking about, to be like, oh, a new vendor came in that can do it in a cloud native way, and an existing vendor can't, and who are the operators going to choose? Well, it depends. I mean, maybe the existing vendor can do 10 things the other guy can't, but you know, it creates a little bit more competition in the market, which is of course hard for folks like him, but you know, it's how we all move forward together. So and hard for folks, frankly. Google is a vendor in there too, right? In the sense of an infrastructure vendor. So it's hard on us too. But that's my sort of vision of it. But I think we're over time. So Sana, do we want to wrap up?
John, I think we had a very involved and interesting discussion today. I think we need to catch up on the remaining requirements with the rest of the organizations presenting and taking the 5 minutes to explain their thoughts in the next session.
Okay.
And meanwhile, we have shared the document with the SIG Automation. Maybe, John, SIG Automation should come back to us with some feedback as well. in one of the future meetings.
Propose, like I said, some I'm going to propose, like, we're just going to keep trying to move forward and iteratively back and forth proposals. So it's not going to match everything you've got here, but like, we have very limited time, right? Like I said, I want to get an alpha sort of release out that does something in a month, and that's not a lot of time. And then if we want to get a V1 out in first quarter of next year, that's not a lot of time, especially with the holidays and everything. So like, it's going to be very limited in scope to get it out in that kind of time frame. But let's just keep moving it forward. And we can't like waterfall this, right? We have to just keep kind of plowing forward and try to come together, converge. So that's all I guess I'm going to say. And Sana, do you want to maybe call? I don't know what works for this group, but in the automation group, we're going to call for weekly meetings starting next week because we're not moving fast enough with bi-weekly. I don't know if it's something you want to send an email or whatever to this group.
Yeah, if this group is good with weekly meetings, and if instead of Monday, if we could use the middle of the week as a day for us to meet weekly for some time until we have converged on the requirements. How do I find out that everybody's good with weekly meeting?
I think we were going to get a tool. Sorry, we're way over, but Tal, I think, was going to hopefully send us a tool that we could use to maybe like a doodle type of
the polling
Yes.
and stuff. Yeah.
Yes.
get a chance to do that. But
So the
that's
day,
the topic of the next SIG release meeting is that sort of thing. So anybody who wants to join, maybe we'll figure that out there since we're
okay, awesome,
Thank
John.
you all. Yep. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Thank you.